Every nation has a beginning. Some are born through peace. Others emerge from revolution. But before the United States became a symbol of freedom, it was simply a collection of distant colonies, ruled by a king thousands of miles away. This is the story of how ordinary people challenged the greatest empire on Earth and changed history forever. Imagine waking up in a world where your future is decided by someone you've never met. A king sits on a throne across an ocean nearly 3,000 miles away. His government writes your laws. His officials collect your taxes. His soldiers patrol your streets. Yet you have no voice in the decisions that shape your life. For millions of people living in Britain's American colonies during the 18th century, this wasn't imagination. It was reality. Today, the United States stands as
Part 2. The War That Changed Everything. Chapter title, Britain's Greatest Victory and Its Greatest Mistake. History often remembers the American Revolution as a fight for freedom. But revolutions rarely begin with grand speeches or declarations. They begin with consequences. And in this case, the consequences of one war would ignite another. By the middle of the 18th century, the British Empire stood at the height of its power. Its merchant ships crossed every major ocean. Its navy ruled the seas. Its colonies stretched across North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. To many Europeans, Britain appeared unstoppable. But another empire had different ambitions. France. For more than a century, Britain and France had competed relentlessly for global dominance. Their rivalry extended far beyond Europe. It reached the Caribbean islands, the trading posts of India, the coast of Africa, and the vast wilderness of North America.
Empires are rarely destroyed by foreign enemies alone. More often, they fall because they fail to understand the people they rule. After defeating France, Britain believed its American colonies owed a debt of gratitude. The colonists believed they had already paid, with their blood, their labor, and their loyalty. The disagreement that followed would change the course of history. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, church bells rang across Britain. The 7 Years' War was over. France had lost most of its North American empire, and Britain stood as the dominant power on the continent. For many in London, it was a glorious victory. The empire was larger than ever, its influence unmatched. But behind the celebrations, Britain's leaders faced a troubling reality. War was expensive. The conflict had nearly doubled Britain's national debt. Maintaining thousands of soldiers in North America, protecting new territories, and governing an expanding empire would require even more money. Prime Minister George Grenville believed the solution was simple. The colonies should help pay. From London's point of view, this seemed reasonable. British taxpayers had financed the war that protected the colonies from French expansion. Surely the colonists could contribute to the cost of their own defense. But the people living in America saw things very differently. For years, colonial militias had fought alongside British regulars. Thousands of colonists had died during the French and Indian War. Merchants had supplied food, equipment, and transportation. Communities had raised local taxes to support the war effort. Many Americans believed they had already paid their share. Now, Parliament wanted more. The first major step came with the Proclamation of 1763. King George III declared that colonists could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains.
When Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, many colonists believed the crisis had ended. They were wrong. Britain had withdrawn one hand, only to tighten the other. Within a year, a new set of taxes would reopen old wounds, and this time, the consequences would be far more dangerous. The celebrations of 1766 did not last long. In London, many members of Parliament were furious. They believed repealing the Stamp Act had made Britain appear weak. If the American colonies could pressure Parliament into changing its laws through protests and boycotts, what authority remained? King George III and his ministers had no intention of allowing the colonies to dictate imperial policy. The following year, a new plan emerged. Its architect was Charles Townshend, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer. Townshend believed he had found a solution to the colonial problem. Instead of taxing legal documents and newspapers, Parliament would place import duties on everyday goods arriving from Britain. In 1767, Parliament approved what became known as the Townshend Acts. The new taxes applied to glass, lead, paint, paper, tea. Unlike the Stamp Act, these
History is not only shaped by battles. Sometimes 5 gunshots in a crowded street can change the destiny of an empire. The winter of 1770 was bitterly cold in Boston. Snow covered the narrow streets. The harbor was lined with ice, and the wind that swept in from the Atlantic carried more than just freezing temperatures. It carried anger. For nearly 2 years, British soldiers had occupied the town. Their red uniforms had become a daily reminder of Parliament's authority. To British officials, the soldiers were there to maintain order. To many Bostonians, they were an occupying army. Every day, tensions grew. Arguments broke out in taverns. Workers fought soldiers over jobs. Children mocked redcoats.
Sometimes history turns not on the battlefield, but around a simple cup of tea. In 1773, a tax that seemed almost insignificant pushed the British Empire and its American colonies to the edge of an irreversible conflict. What followed would become one of the most famous acts of political protest in history. 3 years had passed since the Boston Massacre. The streets of Boston had grown quieter, but beneath the surface, the anger had not disappeared. Many colonists still believed that Parliament had violated their rights. Although most of the Townshend duties had been repealed in 1770, one remained: the tax on tea. To British officials, it was a small matter. To the colonists, it was a dangerous principle. The amount of money collected from the tea tax was relatively small. Most families could easily afford it. But the argument was never about the cost. It was about authority. If Parliament could tax tea today, what would prevent it from taxing land tomorrow, or wages, or property, every purchase made by every family? The colonists feared that accepting even a tiny tax would mean surrendering a principle they had spent years defending. While political tensions continued to simmer in America, another crisis was unfolding across the Atlantic. The British East India Company, one of the largest and most powerful trading corporations in the world, was on the brink of financial collapse. For decades, the company had dominated trade between Britain and Asia. Its ships carried tea, silk, spices, porcelain, and countless luxury goods across the oceans. But years of poor management, corruption, and declining sales had left the company drowning in debt. Warehouses in Britain overflowed with millions of pounds of unsold tea. If the company failed, the consequences would be enormous. Thousands of jobs would be lost. Investors would suffer devastating.
On the night of December 16, 1773, the cold waters of Boston Harbor became the stage for one of history's most famous acts of defiance. No one was killed. No shots were fired. Yet by sunrise, an empire had been publicly challenged, and there would be no turning back. As the deadline approached, Boston held its breath. For nearly 3 weeks, the 3 tea ships, Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, had remained anchored in the harbor. Their cargo, 342 chests of East India Company tea, remained untouched. Every day, larger crowds gathered in the city. Merchants, craftsmen, sailors, ministers, lawyers, and farmers packed into Boston's meeting halls. The largest gathering took place at the Old South Meeting House, where thousands of colonists squeezed inside, while many more waited outside in the freezing streets. It was one of the largest public meetings ever held in colonial America,
The mood was tense. Many still hoped Governor Thomas Hutchinson would allow the tea ships to leave without unloading their cargo. A final request had been sent. For more than a decade, the American colonies had argued with Britain through petitions, protests, and boycotts. But after the Intolerable Acts, many colonists reached a sobering conclusion. If they continued to stand alone, they would fall, one by one. Their only hope was unity. The news of Parliament's punishment of Boston spread quickly across North America. From the rocky coast of New England to the rice plantations of South Carolina, people read newspaper accounts describing the closure of Boston Harbor. Merchants worried about trade. Farmers worried about the economy. Lawyers debated the legality of Britain's actions. Church ministers preached sermons about liberty and justice. Although the Intolerable Acts had been directed specifically at Massachusetts, many colonists believed they were witnessing something much larger. If Parliament could strip one colony of its rights, it could strip all of them. For the first time, the 13 colonies faced a common question.
No one standing on Lexington Green in the early hours of April 19, 1775, could have known that the events of that morning would echo across centuries. The first shots fired there would inspire revolutions around the world and mark the birth of a new nation. The spring of 1775 had arrived in Massachusetts. Although flowers were beginning to bloom across the countryside, peace was fading. For months, General Thomas Gage had watched the growing resistance with increasing concern. Reports from British spies suggested that colonial militias were storing muskets, gunpowder, and cannon in the town of Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. To British officials, these weapons represented a direct threat to royal authority. If they could seize them before the militia organized, perhaps the crisis could still be contained. General Gage carefully planned a secret operation. On the evening of April 18, 1775, nearly 700 British regulars, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn, quietly prepared to leave Boston. Their mission was simple: march to Concord, confiscate the military supplies, arrest revolutionary leaders if the opportunity arose. The operation was intended to be swift and quiet, but it would be neither. The Patriots had been watching. For weeks, Boston's revolutionary network had closely monitored every British movement. Among its most trusted members was Paul Revere, a silversmith and messenger. He had already carried secret messages